One of our duties as citizens of Aotearoa, New Zealand, is to engage with the democratic process. And they're off. Opportunities to vote already underway. I know some people have already voted. We've got less than 2 weeks to make our decisions and cast our vote. And, somebody who is watching keenly the process as it unfolds is a political commentator, Dr. Bryce Edwards. Bryce, kia ora, good morning.
Morning, Andrew.
Have you voted yet, by the way? It's none of my business, but if you don't mind answering.
Well, to be honest, Andrew, I don't vote. I try not to, ever make a decision on which party to vote for as a political commentator to try and be objective. So I don't back any horse in this race. Mm-hmm. I'm visiting Nelson at the moment. I took my father, who's in a retirement village, to vote yesterday, and he enjoyed that, and he was determined to do so. But I recognise a lot of people aren't going to vote this time round. Yeah. I'm really hearing, seeing a lot of signs that people are just over this election. They're not too enthusiastic. Yeah. I think the people that are most likely to turn out are, obviously the most sort of tribal supporters of both National and Labour, but the ones in the middle, maybe not so much. So we had overseas voting starting last week, and then on Monday, the advance voting. So anyone can vote. From Monday, anyone can just turn up at one of those community centres, voting booths. There's heaps of them around. There's 17 parties to vote for, and then, of course, all your local electorate candidates. But the Electoral Commission gives out details after each day about how many people have voted. Okay. And so for that first day of voting, only about 50,000 people voted. Wow. Which compared to last election is about half the amount that voted on the first day. So it is looking like people aren't so much in a hurry to do so this time around.
Hey, for old dogs like me, it's still getting used to, but it's not the same because it's not election day. It's not the thing that you do where you go down to your local school or library and...
You're in a minority there, Andrew. Even at the last election, most New Zealanders voted prior to polling day. Yeah. So really it is a 2-week period, and we'll probably have about 80% of people voting prior to October 14.
So, there's a sign. Get my act together. Catch up, Andrew. There we go. Of course, Christopher Luxon has shown some leadership in that regard. He's already voted. Chris Hipkins probably got the best and worst excuse ever with having COVID just before Election Day. It's, got to take some wind out of his already sagging sails, perhaps.
Yeah, look, it has come at a crucial time, just as we're coming into the last 2 weeks of the campaign. He's laid up in bed. You've got to feel sorry for him, although often what happens in election campaigns, at least overseas, is people get a bit of a sympathy vote for these things. And, sometimes the less you see of leaders, surprisingly, the more they do.
Perhaps a strategic move from Chippy in that regard. Hey, speaking of strategic, because honestly, I was never particularly good at strategy, with the possible exception of online strategy gaming, but... when it comes to strategic voting, here's my general idea. Now, not telling anybody how they should vote, but, I hear some people go, I'm voting strategically. Basically, does that mean, you vote for a major party for your local electorate, because unless you live in Epsom, they're the ones that are going to get in anyway, statistically. But for your party vote, you go for one of the minor parties on your side of the spectrum to keep them honest? Is that the general play for strategic voting?
Well, I think it makes a lot of logical sense because, yes, in the electorate races, it's not very often that a candidate other than the Labour and National one are going to win, and it's the party vote that really determines things. And so, yes, minor parties, that's the best bet. And I think there will be, we see it in the polls, we will see a lot of people voting for minor parties to, keep the major parties honest. But I would just point out quickly that there are quite a few electorates this time round where there are 3 horse races going on, that it's not entirely clear that Labour and National are going to win. So yes, you've mentioned Tamaki. It's a race between ACT and National and the candidates there. Auckland Central, of course, Chloe Swarbrick holds that at the moment for the Green Party, but she's being we've seen polling to show that she's being nipped at the heels by the national candidate. In Wellington Central, it's very interesting, where I am normally. We've got Grant Robertson isn't standing there. Instead, his replacement is Ibrahim Omar, and he's winning in the polls that we've seen. But we've got the national candidate, Scott Sheeran, and the Green candidate, Tamitha Paul, very close behind. Yeah. And so strategic voting takes on a different sense in those ones, because if you're a left-wing voter and you want either the Greens or Labour to win, you really have to pick one of those sides, because National could come through the middle. And so if enough people vote for the Greens instead of the Labour candidate, or vice versa, yes, it could be strategically an own goal in getting National in.
I mean, speaking of own goals in that regard, and talking about, I suppose, motivation for voting, there is perhaps an unprecedented amount of what people describe as minnow parties this time round. Lots of parties under the 1% threshold, and perhaps each one of them represent a disenfranchised, angry group of society that are angry about a particular issue. And they're very motivated to vote. The problem is that each one is like a small cluster. None of them have got the numbers to get over the line. And I was reading an article earlier today, actually, which talked about how, look, if you vote for a party which doesn't cross the threshold, that actually your vote will be allocated to one of the big parties who you really don't want to get back in. I mean, this is almost like reverse strategic voting. Yes, you may be passionate about a particular candidate or a particular minor issue, but your vote may be used against you because of some of the details of MMP. What's your thoughts?
Well, yes, we have that 5% MMP threshold, which I personally think is way too high. And it means that if you vote for a party that's below that threshold and doesn't get an electorate seat, doesn't win it, then your vote is pretty much discarded in the count. So,
although it does get reallocated, doesn't it? It does get...
I guess, and you could conceptualize it as being reallocated. It gets reallocated in the same proportions of all the other votes in the parliament. So, but it's probably best just to think of it. I think it's most simple. Just that it's disregarded. It's just discarded by the count if that party stays below 5%. So there's a lot of minor parties or minnow parties, as you say. Loyal New Zealand, New Zealand. They're going to struggle to get anywhere near 1% of the vote. So yes, that essentially is a wasted vote. But I guess some people do want to give something of a protest vote, or they want to stand up for their principles. And, I guess that's something in itself, isn't it? That if you really strongly believe in a party, even though they're not going to, get in, you're still having your say and you're helping that party, get somewhere and onto the agenda, perhaps. And maybe they'll build up and do better for a subsequent election. Yeah, no,
and certainly, this is a participatory democracy. People can cast their vote in the direction they're most passionate about. You don't need to necessarily break out the slide rule to figure out proportions and all those sorts of things. And certainly when it comes to motivation for voting, you mentioned this earlier, potentially a lower voter turnout this year. Those that are motivated might not get to the threshold. I mean, honestly, Bryce, you've confessed that you're part of the problem in this regard, but for very good reasons.
True. So, I mean, throughout the world, we've had reduced participation in elections over the last 50, 60 years. It's all been going downhill. In recent years, it turned around a bit, especially in New Zealand, and we've seen the numbers go up in the last two elections. But generally, you're seeing about, I don't know, a fifth or even up to a quarter of those that are eligible to vote choosing not to. And maybe it's because they're apathetic, maybe it's because they're too busy, but there certainly is a sense of discontent out there at the moment that that they're not. There's some people that just are not inspired enough by what either Chris is promising or some of these minor parties. So they're just not turning out at all. And I think we should take kind of heed of that. If we are going to have a low voter turnout, it does suggest something's a bit broken in our electoral system, or our political system at least. And yes, people like myself are kind of inclined to blame the voters and tell them off that they're not doing their democratic duty. But I do wonder whether it is a problem with the politicians not offering something good enough for the public to actually get inspired by.
Well, certainly still over a week and a bit to go, of course, and those things may change, particularly if people like me get motivated to get in early and not just wait for the Saturday. Although, yeah, I don't know. I'm perhaps a little bit stuck in that tradition, Bryce. Always a pleasure.
There's nothing wrong with that.
Well, as long as I don't leave it till Sunday, right? The following.
True,
exactly.
true.
Hey, always a pleasure to chat with you. Thanks for being on the program again.
Thanks, Andrew.